The First Crusade, a pivotal moment in medieval history, emerged from a world vastly different from our own, a world where faith and earthly power were inextricably intertwined. Imagine, if you will, the 11th century, a tapestry of disparate realms stretching from the verdant fields of Western Europe to the sun-drenched deserts of the Levant. In the lands that would one day be called France, Germany, and England, life for most was bound to the rhythm of the seasons. Dictated by the plow and the church bell, feudal lords, often little more than glorified bandits, held sway over their small domains, their castles rising like stone teeth from the landscape. Knights, clad in mail and driven by a complex code of honor and violence, were the enforcers of this fractured order. Their lives were often short and brutal, punctuated by local skirmishes and the constant threat of famine or disease. Yet, beneath this rough exterior, a burgeoning spiritual fervor was taking root, nurtured by monastic reforms and the growing influence of the papacy. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Byzantine Empire, the venerable successor to the Roman Empire, still shone with a fading glory. Its capital, Constantinople, a city of unparalleled splendor, stood as a bulwark against encroaching powers, its walls having withstood centuries of sieges. But even this ancient empire, once the undisputed master of the Eastern Mediterranean, was in decline. Its territories had been steadily eroded by various foes, most notably the Seljuk Turks. These nomadic warriors, having embraced Islam, had swept out of Central Asia in the 10th and 11th centuries, establishing a vast, albeit loosely controlled, empire that stretched from Persia to Anatolia. Their victories, particularly the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071, had shattered Byzantine dominance in Asia Minor, bringing them perilously close to Constantinople itself. This defeat was a profound shock to the Christian world, as it opened the door for Turkish expansion into lands that had been Christian for centuries. Beyond the Byzantine frontier lay the Holy Land, a region revered by Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. Jerusalem, the city of prophets and miracles, was under Muslim control, as it had been for over 4 centuries since its conquest in 637 CE by the Rashidun Caliphate. For much of this period, Christian pilgrims had generally been able to visit the holy sites, though their experiences varied depending on the local rulers. However, with the rise of the Seljuk Turks, the situation became more precarious. While not always intentionally hostile, the new Turkish rulers were less tolerant and less organized than their Fatimid predecessors in Egypt, who had previously controlled Jerusalem. Reports of harassment, extortion, and even violence against pilgrims began to filter back to Europe, fueling a growing sense of outrage and concern among the Christian populace. These tales, often exaggerated by distance and fervent belief, painted a picture of sacrilege and oppression, stirring a deep desire to reclaim the sacred sites. The various Christian kingdoms of Europe, however, were not a unified entity. They were a patchwork of competing loyalties, dynastic struggles, and internal feuds. The Church, under the assertive leadership of figures like Pope Gregory VII and later Urban II, sought to impose a moral and political order on this chaotic landscape. The concept of peace of God and truce of God movements had attempted to curb the endemic violence among feudal lords, aiming to channel their martial energies toward more righteous causes. The idea of a holy war, or bellum sacrum, was not entirely new, but it had largely been applied to conflicts against pagans or internal heresies. The prospect of an external enemy, one that threatened the very heart of Christendom's spiritual heritage, offered a powerful new direction for this restless warrior class. It was against this backdrop of Byzantine pleas for aid, mounting reports of pilgrim mistreatment, and a restless, religiously fervent Western European society that Pope Urban II, made his momentous journey to Clermont, a town in central France, in November of 1095. He had received an appeal from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who sought mercenary aid against the Seljuk Turks. Urban, however, saw an opportunity to achieve far more than just military assistance for Byzantium. He envisioned a grand enterprise that would not only relieve the Eastern Christians but also reunite the fractured Christian Church, assert papal authority, and, crucially, direct the violent energies of European knights away from internal conflicts and toward a common holy purpose. On November 27, 1095, Urban II delivered a sermon that would echo through centuries, igniting a movement that reshaped the world. Standing before a large crowd of clergy and nobles, perhaps even commoners, gathered in an open field outside the town, his words were a powerful blend of spiritual exhortation, strategic vision, and emotional appeal. Though no definitive transcript exists, chroniclers of the time, such as Fulcher of Chartres and Robert the Monk, recorded versions of his speech, capturing its essence. He spoke of the plight of the Eastern Christians, of their lands being ravaged by a foreign race, a race absolutely alien to God, referring to the Seljuk Turks. He painted vivid pictures of desecrated churches and suffering pilgrims, urging his listeners to take up arms not for earthly gain, but for the salvation of their souls. Let those who have been accustomed to make private war against the faithful, he is reported to have declared, now go against the infidels and end with victory this war, which should have been begun long ago. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights of Christ. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving for a few pieces of silver now obtain an eternal reward. He promised spiritual absolution, a remission of sins, for those who undertook this perilous journey, framing it as a pilgrimage, a holy act of penance. The rallying cry, Deus vult, God wills it, erupted from the crowd, a spontaneous outpouring of fervent belief that swept through the assembly. The response was immediate and overwhelming, far exceeding Urban's initial expectations. The call to arms spread like wildfire across Europe, carried by enthusiastic preachers and the sheer power of the idea itself. But the initial wave of enthusiasm was not confined to the disciplined knights and nobles Urban had likely envisioned. Instead, it ignited a spontaneous, chaotic movement among the common people, a phenomenon that came to be known as the People's Crusade. This was a testament to the deep religious fervor of the age, but also to the desperate conditions many faced. For peasants and the urban poor, the crusade offered not just spiritual salvation, but also a potential escape from poverty, famine, and the oppressive feudal system. The promise of riches in the East, though secondary to the spiritual motivation for many, certainly played a part for others. Led by charismatic, if often misguided, figures like Peter the Hermit, a fiery preacher from Amiens who traveled extensively, barefoot and clad in a rough tunic, preaching the crusade with passionate conviction. And Walter Sans Avoir, Walter the Penniless, these masses of ordinary folk began to march eastward in the spring of 1096, months before the main armies of the nobles were ready. They were a motley collection: peasants, women, children, elderly, and even some lesser knights, often poorly armed, entirely lacking in military discipline, and with little understanding of the vast distances and logistical challenges that lay ahead. Their journey across Europe was marked by desperation and tragedy. Lacking provisions and funds, Hay resorted to pillaging the lands they passed through, often clashing with local populations. A particularly dark chapter of the People's Crusade unfolded in the Rhineland, where groups of crusaders, fueled by anti-Jewish sentiment and a warped interpretation of their holy mission, perpetrated horrific massacres against Jewish communities in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne in May and June of 1096. These atrocities, which saw thousands of innocent men, women, and children murdered, were condemned by local bishops, but largely unchecked by the Crusaders' leaders, illustrating the volatile and often brutal nature of this popular uprising. Historians still debate the precise motivations for these pogroms, whether they were primarily religious zealotry, economic opportunism, or a combination of factors. But their devastating impact on Jewish life in Europe was undeniable and long-lasting. As the People's Crusade pressed on, their numbers dwindled from starvation, disease, and desertion. By the time they reached Constantinople in August 1096, they were a shadow of their former selves, ragged, exhausted, and a considerable nuisance to Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had expected disciplined soldiers, not an unruly mob. Despite Alexios's warnings and advice to wait for the main Crusader armies, Peter the Hermit's followers, impatient and overconfident, crossed the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. There, in October 1096, they were ambushed and utterly annihilated by the Seljuk Turks near Civitate, just outside Nicaea. Thousands were slaughtered, effectively ending the People's Crusade as a military force. Only a small remnant, including Peter the Hermit, managed to escape back to Constantinople. This disastrous beginning served as a stark, brutal lesson in the realities of long-distance warfare and the perils of uncontrolled religious zeal. The stage was now set for the arrival of the organized armies of the European nobility, who would embark on the First Crusade proper, learning from the tragic mistakes of their predecessors. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The year 1096 dawned, and with it, a new kind of pilgrimage began to stir across the varied landscapes of Europe. No longer were these journeys solitary acts of penance or quiet devotion. Instead, the air thrummed with a collective fervor, a sense of shared destiny. The People's Crusade, with its tragic, swift end, had served as a stark, if unintentional, prelude. Now, the true force was gathering. The princely crusade, led by some of the most powerful and ambitious nobles of the West. Their motivations, like the rivers that crisscross the continent, flowed from diverse sources. Piety, certainly, but also the allure of land, the promise of glory, and the desire to escape the often stifling confines of feudal Europe. From the northern reaches of Loringia came Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a man whose piety was as renowned as his martial skill. He was accompanied by his brothers, Eustace and Baldwin, the latter of whom would carve out a destiny far from his ancestral lands. From the south of France, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse and Provence, a figure of immense wealth and influence, brought a vast contingent, his eyes perhaps fixed as much on earthly dominion as on heavenly reward. From Normandy, Robert Curthos, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, a man of mercurial temperament, joined the ranks. Driven perhaps by a longing for adventure or a desire to escape the shadow of his younger brother, King William II of England, and from southern Italy, the Normans, led by Bohemond of Taranto, son of Robert Guiscard, a cunning and ambitious warrior, brought their formidable military prowess, their minds already envisioning new principalities in the east. These disparate forces, speaking different tongues and bound by varying loyalties, began their arduous journey in late 1096. Their paths, by necessity, diverged, each contingent seeking the most viable routes for their immense numbers and their accompanying baggage trains. Godfrey's forces, for instance, traveled through Hungary, a journey fraught with tension and occasional skirmishes with local populations unaccustomed to such vast armed migrations. Raymond of Toulouse, on the other hand, chose the route through the Lombard Plain and across the Balkan Peninsula, a path that brought him into closer contact with the Byzantine Empire. The logistical challenges were immense, almost unimaginable, feeding tens of thousands of men, not to mention their horses and camp followers, in lands often hostile or simply unprepared for such an influx, required constant foraging and negotiation. Disease, too, was an ever-present companion, thinning their ranks as surely as any enemy blade. Yet they pressed on, drawn by the distant siren call of Jerusalem. Their first major rendezvous point was Constantinople, the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, watched the arrival of these Western armies with a mixture of relief and profound apprehension. He had, after all, appealed for mercenary aid, not a full-scale invasion of armed pilgrims. He saw their numbers, their formidable armaments, and their often unruly demeanor, and understood that these crusaders, for all their professed piety, were a force that needed careful management. Alexios's primary concern was the security of his own empire and the restoration of Byzantine territories lost to the Seljuk Turks. He sought oaths of fealty from the Crusader leaders, demanding that any lands conquered from the Turks that had once belonged to Byzantium be returned to imperial control. This proved to be a point of considerable friction. While some leaders, like Godfrey, reluctantly swore the oath, others, like Raymond of Toulouse and particularly Bohemond of Taranto, were far more resistant, their ambitions clashing directly with the emperor's. The negotiations were tense, often punctuated by displays of mutual suspicion, but ultimately the Crusaders, needing Byzantine support and supplies, largely acquiesced, though with mental reservations that would later prove significant. Having crossed the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, the Crusaders faced their first major test, the city of Nicaea. This strategically important city, once a Byzantine stronghold, had fallen to the Seljuk Turks and served as the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. In May 1097, the Crusader armies, now somewhat unified, laid siege to Nicaea. The siege was a protracted affair, lasting several weeks, marked by fierce resistance from the Turkish garrison. The Crusaders employed siege engines and blockaded the city, but the Turks maintained a crucial supply line across Lake Ascanian. It was here that Alexios's pragmatism came into play. He secretly negotiated with the Turkish defenders, promising them safe passage if they surrendered to him rather than to the Crusaders. The Crusaders awoke one morning to find the imperial banners flying over the walls of Nicaea, the city having surrendered to the Byzantines. This act, while strategically sound for Alexios, deeply embittered the Crusaders, fueling their distrust of the Byzantines and reinforcing their belief that they were on their own. From Nicaea, the Crusader army, now numbering perhaps 30,000 to 35,000 fighting men, continued its march southeastward. The journey across the Anatolian plateau was grueling, marked by scorching heat, scarce water, and constant harassment from Turkish skirmishers. The army, by necessity, divided into two main columns for easier foraging. This division, however, nearly proved disastrous. On July 1, 1097, near Dorylaeum, Bohemond's column, which included Robert Curthos and Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, was ambushed by a large Seljuk force led by Kilij Arslan I, the Sultan of Rum. The battle was fierce and desperate. The Crusaders formed a defensive square, their heavy cavalry and infantry enduring wave after wave of Turkish arrows and charges. For hours, they fought for their lives under the blazing sun, their situation growing increasingly dire. Just as their lines seemed about to break, the Second Crusader column, led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse arrived, having been alerted by frantic messengers. Their timely intervention turned the tide, catching the Turks in a pincer movement and forcing them to retreat. The victory at Dorylaeum, though hard-won, was a crucial morale boost, proving the Crusaders' resilience and their ability to defeat a formidable Turkish army in open battle. It also highlighted the importance of maintaining cohesion, even amidst the vastness of their journey. The march continued, ever southward, through the Cilician Gates, a narrow mountain pass that offered a strategic gateway into Syria. Here, the political landscape became even more complex, a mosaic of independent Muslim emirates, Armenian Christian principalities, and scattered Byzantine remnants. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, sensing an opportunity for personal gain, broke away from the main army. He led his contingent eastward, through Armenian lands, and eventually, in 1098, established the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader States. Edessa, a city with a rich Christian history, welcomed Baldwin, seeing him as a protector against the surrounding Muslim powers. This act, while demonstrating the Crusaders' opportunistic nature and their deviation from the original pilgrimage vow, also secured a vital eastern flank for the main Crusader advance. Meanwhile, the main Crusader army turned its attention to Antioch. This ancient city, once a jewel of the Roman Empire and a cradle of early Christianity, was now a formidable Seljuk stronghold, protected by massive walls and a strong garrison. The siege of Antioch, beginning in October 1097, would prove to be the longest and most brutal test of the First Crusade. It lasted for 8 grueling months, a period of immense suffering, starvation, and despair for the Crusaders. The city's defense. Pharaohs were formidable, its walls towering, its citadel perched high on a hill. The Crusaders, lacking sufficient numbers to fully encircle the city, established camps around its northern and western sides, leaving the southern and eastern gates partially open, which allowed for some resupply to the besieged. As winter set in, conditions in the Crusader camp deteriorated rapidly. Food became scarce, disease rampant. Horses, vital for cavalry, died in large numbers, their meat often consumed by the starving soldiers. Desertions became common, with some Crusaders, including the notorious Peter the Hermit, who had led the People's Crusade, attempting to flee. They were often brought back by force, a testament to the harsh discipline required to maintain cohesion. The Crusaders also faced repeated attempts by Muslim relief armies to break the siege. The most significant of these was led by Ridwan of Aleppo, who launched an attack in February 1098, and later by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, whose army was even larger and more threatening. These battles, fought outside the walls of Antioch, were desperate affairs, testing the Crusaders' resolve to its limits. The breakthrough came in June 1098 through an act of treachery. Bohemund of Taranto, ever the pragmatist, had secretly cultivated a relationship with a disgruntled Armenian guard named Firuz, who controlled one of the city's towers. In exchange for a promise of the city for himself, Bohemund arranged for a small group of Crusaders to scale the walls at night. Once inside, they opened a gate, and the Crusader army, now a shadow of its former self, poured into the city. The ensuing conquest of Antioch was a brutal affair. The Crusaders, fueled by months of starvation, hardship, and religious fervor, unleashed their pent-up fury on the Muslim inhabitants. The streets ran with blood, and the city was plundered mercilessly. Yet their triumph was short-lived. Just days after their entry, Kerboga's massive relief army arrived, encircling the Crusaders inside the very city they had just captured. The hunters had become the hunted. The situation inside Antioch became even more desperate than the siege itself. The Crusaders were trapped, starving, and surrounded by a numerically superior enemy. Morale plummeted, and many contemplated surrender. It was during this darkest hour that a remarkable event occurred, one that would galvanize the Crusaders and perhaps save the entire expedition. A poor peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had visions, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross. After much skepticism and a dramatic excavation in the Church of St. Peter, a piece of iron, believed to be the lance, was indeed discovered. Whether this was a genuine relic, a pious fraud, or a desperate act of inspiration, its effect was undeniable. The discovery of the Holy Lance ignited a wave of religious ecstasy and renewed determination among the Crusaders. It was seen as a divine sign, a promise of victory. With their spirits rekindled, the Crusader leaders, despite their weakened state, made a daring decision to sally forth and confront Kerboga's army in open battle. On June 28, 1098, the Crusader army, led by Bohemond, marched out of Antioch's gates, their ranks thin, but their resolve hardened by desperation and belief. They formed into several divisions, their banners unfurling in the morning sun. The battle that followed was one of the most astonishing victories of the First Crusade. Kerboga's army, vast and seemingly invincible, was caught off guard by the Crusaders' aggressive charge and their unwavering determination. Accounts speak of miraculous interventions, of saints fighting alongside the Crusaders, but the reality was likely a combination of Crusader desperation, effective tactics, and disunity within Kerboga's own forces. Some of Kerboga's emirs, distrustful of him, abandoned the field. The result was a rout. Kerboga's army disintegrated, fleeing in disarray, leaving behind vast amounts of supplies, and effectively ending the threat to Antioch. The victory was hailed as a miracle, a testament to God's favor. With Antioch secured, the Crusaders faced a new set of challenges: internal divisions. The question of who would rule Antioch became a major point of contention. Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most senior of the Crusader leaders, wished to press on to Jerusalem immediately, seeing the capture of Antioch as merely a stepping stone. Bohemond, however, having played a pivotal role in the city's capture, and having secured the promise from Firuz, laid claim to Antioch for himself. The dispute dragged on for months, highlighting the conflicting ambitions that lay beneath the veneer of shared religious zeal. Ultimately, Bohemond's claim prevailed, and he became the first prince of Antioch, establishing the second of the Crusader States. This decision, however, further strained relations among the leaders and delayed the final push to Jerusalem. The long delay in Antioch, from June 1098 to January 1099, was also partly due to the Crusaders' exhaustion and the need to rest and resupply. Many of the rank and file, however, grew increasingly impatient, their vows urging them onward to the Holy City. Their pressure, combined with a growing sense of divine impatience, finally spurred the leaders to action. In January 1099, a significantly reduced Crusader army, perhaps no more than 12,000 to 15,000 fighting men, began its final march towards Jerusalem. Raymond of Toulouse, still hoping to lead the expedition, took the vanguard, followed by Godfrey of Bouillon and Robert of Normandy. Bohemond remained in Antioch, consolidating his new principality. The journey southward was less fraught with large-scale battles than the earlier stages, as the local Muslim rulers, having witnessed the Crusaders' tenacity, often chose to pay tribute or offer supplies rather than risk open confrontation. The Crusaders passed through coastal towns like Arca and Tripoli, encountering the familiar landscape of the Levant. As they drew closer to Jerusalem, the anticipation grew palpable. On June 7, 1099, after nearly 3 years of relentless marching and brutal warfare, the Crusader army finally caught sight of their ultimate goal, the walls of Jerusalem. Accounts from the time describe the emotional outpouring, the tears of joy and reverence, as the Crusaders fell to their knees, some kissing the ground, others weeping openly at the sight of the holy city. But emotion quickly gave way to the grim realities of siege warfare. Jerusalem, though not as heavily fortified as Antioch, was still a formidable challenge. Its walls were strong, its garrison well supplied, and its defenders, under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, were prepared for a fight. The Crusaders, having suffered immense losses throughout their journey, lacked the numbers to fully invest the city. They also faced a severe shortage of water, as the Fatimids had poisoned or filled the wells outside the city. The summer heat was intense, and the Crusaders suffered greatly from thirst. Initially, the Crusaders attempted a direct assault on June 13th, a desperate, ill-prepared attack that was repulsed with heavy losses. It became clear that a prolonged siege, requiring proper siege engines, was necessary. The Crusaders, with remarkable ingenuity and determination, set about constructing 2 massive siege towers, one under the direction of Godfrey of Bouillon and the other by Raymond of Toulouse. This was an immense undertaking, requiring timber to be hauled from distant forests and skilled craftsmen to be found or improvised. The construction was carried out under constant harassment from the city's defenders, who launched projectiles and flaming arrows. The final assault on Jerusalem began on July 13th. For 2 days, the Crusaders launched relentless attacks, their siege towers, slowly inching towards the walls. The fighting was ferocious, hand-to-hand combat on the ramparts. The defenders hurled rocks, boiling oil, and Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary weapon. The Crusaders, driven by their religious fervor and the desperate knowledge that this was their last chance, fought with unparalleled ferocity. On July 15th, 1099, the breakthrough came. Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower, having been moved under the cover of darkness to a less defended section of the wall, finally breached the outer defenses. A small group of knights, led by a knight named Lefold, managed to gain a foothold on the ramparts. They were quickly followed by Godfrey himself and Eustace, his brother. Once inside, they opened a gate, and the Crusader army poured into the city. The fall of Jerusalem was, like Antioch, marked by an horrific massacre. The Crusaders, having endured years of hardship and fueled by a fervent belief that they were cleansing the holy city of infidels, unleashed a torrent of violence upon its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Accounts from the time, both Crusader and Arab, speak of rivers of blood, of bodies piled high in the streets. While historians still debate the exact numbers and extent of the slaughter, it is clear that the event was a brutal and devastating culmination of the Crusade, leaving an indelible stain on its legacy. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were plundered, their treasures seized. With the city secured, the Crusaders faced the task of establishing a government for their newly won territories. The question of who would rule Jerusalem, the holiest of cities, was a complex one. Raymond of Toulouse, perhaps recognizing the immense spiritual burden, refused the title of king, stating he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Godfrey of Bouillon, similarly pious, also refused the title of king. Instead, taking the more humble title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. This choice reflected the deep religious sentiment that still permeated the Crusader leadership, despite their earlier political machinations. Thus, in July 1099, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was established. With Godfrey as its first ruler, it was the most important of the 4 Crusader states. The others were the County of Edessa, established earlier by Baldwin of Boulogne, the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond, and soon to follow, the County of Tripoli, established by Raymond of Toulouse's heirs after his death. These states, carved out of the Levant, were feudal entities, mini-Europes transplanted into the East, dependent on a constant flow of new recruits and supplies from the West. They were vulnerable, isolated outposts in a predominantly Muslim world, and their continued existence would depend on a delicate balance of military strength, diplomatic maneuvering, and the often unpredictable flow of crusaders from Europe. The First Crusade was a unique event in history, a convergence of religious fervor, political ambition, and sheer human endurance. It achieved its stated goal: the capture of Jerusalem, a feat that seemed almost impossible given the distances, the logistical challenges, and the formidable opposition. Yet, the triumph was also shadowed by the immense suffering, the internal squabbles, and the brutal violence that characterized its path. The establishment of the Crusader States marked a new chapter in the history of the Middle East, initiating a period of Latin Christian presence that would last for nearly 2 centuries, forever altering the political and cultural landscape of the region. The walls of Jerusalem, having witnessed centuries of shifting empires and faiths, now stood under a new, albeit fragile, banner, their ancient stones holding the echoes of both fervent prayer and desperate cries. With Jerusalem now held by the Crusaders, the initial fervor of conquest began to yield to the arduous task of governance. The First Crusade had not been a unified military campaign under a single leader, but rather a series of independent armies converging on a common goal. This fragmentation, while perhaps lending an unexpected resilience to the initial assault, now presented a profound challenge to the establishment of a coherent political entity. The leaders, each accustomed to their own feudal domains in the West, found themselves in a land utterly alien, surrounded by peoples of different faiths and customs. The very concept of a Latin Christian kingdom in the Levant was unprecedented, and its architects had to improvise, drawing upon the familiar structures of European feudalism while adapting to the unique realities of the East. Godfrey of Bouillon, initially offered the title of King of Jerusalem, famously refused to wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He chose instead the more humble yet equally powerful designation of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. This decision, perhaps born of piety, perhaps of political pragmatism, given the lingering influence of the Church, set a tone for the nascent state. His tenure, however, was brief, lasting little more than a year before his death in 1100. It was his brother, Baldwin I, who would embrace the full regality, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a true monarchy. Baldwin, a man of considerable ambition and military prowess, understood that the survival of the Crusader states depended not just on holding the Holy City, but on extending their territorial control and securing vital coastal access. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though the most prominent, was not the sole Crusader state. To its north lay the County of Edessa, the first Crusader state to be established, founded by Baldwin of Boulogne himself before he became King of Jerusalem. Further west, along the Mediterranean coast, lay the Principality of Antioch, founded by Bohemond of Taranto after a brutal and prolonged siege. And to the south of Antioch, nestled between the Orontes River and the coast, was the county of Tripoli, the last of the major Crusader states to be fully consolidated. A process that took several more years under the leadership of Raymond IV of Toulouse's heirs. Each of these states, though theoretically bound by a common faith and a shared interest in survival, often operated with a remarkable degree of independence, sometimes even engaging in rivalries that threatened their collective security. The social structure of these new Latin states was a fascinating, often precarious, blend of European feudalism superimposed upon a diverse Levantine population. At the apex was the king or prince, beneath whom were the great barons, holding vast fiefs in exchange for military service and loyalty. These barons, many of whom had been prominent figures in the Crusade, formed a powerful high court that often checked the monarch's power. Unlike in Europe, where land was often tied to lineage over generations, the Crusader states saw a more fluid, almost meritocratic, distribution of power in their early years, as new arrivals and successful military commanders could rise quickly. Yet beneath this ruling elite, the vast majority of the population remained non-Latin Christians, Syriac Orthodox, Armenian, Greek Orthodox, and Muslims. These indigenous populations were not simply conquered subjects, they were integral to the functioning of the states. They continued to farm the land, ply their trades in the cities, and pay taxes. While they were generally allowed to practice their religions, their legal status was often ambiguous. They were not considered full citizens in the Frankish sense, yet they were not enslaved. They lived under their own customary laws for many civil matters, while serious crimes or disputes involving Franks were typically handled by the Latin courts. This coexistence, though often tense, was also pragmatic. The Franks were a minority, and they depended on the local populations for labor, resources, and even knowledge of the land. It was not uncommon for Frankish lords to employ Muslim or Christian native administrators, or to consult with local leaders. Some historians even point to instances of cultural exchange, with Franks adopting local customs, dress, or even Arabic words into their vocabulary, though this was likely more common among the lower ranks and in rural areas. One of the lesser-known aspects of these early Crusader states was the significant role played by the Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These powerful trading cities had provided crucial naval support during the Crusade, transporting troops and supplies, and aiding in the sieges of coastal cities. In return, they demanded and received extensive commercial privileges within the newly conquered territories. They established their own quarters in the port cities, known as fondaci, complete with their own churches, warehouses, and legal jurisdiction. These enclaves became vital arteries of trade, connecting the Crusader states to the wider Mediterranean world, but also creating powerful, semi-autonomous entities within the Latin kingdoms, sometimes even challenging the authority of the local Frankish rulers. Their ships brought pilgrims and new recruits from Europe and carried back exotic goods, but they also facilitated the movement of intelligence and goods between Crusader and Muslim territories, blurring the lines of conflict. The military organization of the Crusader states was also unique. While the feudal levy provided a corps of knights, the constant threat from surrounding Muslim powers necessitated a more permanent and professional fighting force. This led to the rise of the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These were revolutionary institutions, combining monastic vows with military training. The Templars, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem, quickly grew into a formidable fighting force and a powerful financial institution, establishing a vast network of castles and commanderies across Europe and the Levant. The Hospitallers, initially established to care for sick pilgrims, also evolved into a military order, becoming equally renowned for their fighting prowess and their extensive hospital network. These orders, bound by their own rules and ultimately answerable only to the Pope, often operated independently of the king, sometimes even possessing more wealth and military strength than the monarch himself. This dual power structure, while providing essential defense, also created potential points of friction within the Latin states. The precarious relationships with surrounding Muslim powers defined the very existence of the Crusader states. From the moment of their creation, these Frankish enclaves were surrounded by a mosaic of Muslim emirates and sultanates, each with its own internal dynamics and shifting alliances. To the north and east lay the Seljuk Turks, whose vast but fragmented empire was still recovering from internal strife and the initial shock of the Crusader invasion. To the south, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shiite dynasty that, despite its religious differences with the Sunni Seljuks, often found common cause in opposing the Franks. Early on, the Muslim response was often fragmented and uncoordinated. The initial Crusader victories had been facilitated by the disunity among the various Muslim rulers, who were often more concerned with fighting each other than with expelling the Latin invaders. This allowed the Crusaders a crucial window to consolidate their gains. However, as the Frankish presence became more established and their raids on Muslim territories more frequent, a more unified resistance slowly began to coalesce. Figures like Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, would later emerge as powerful leaders dedicated to the jihad against the Franks. The relationship was not, however, one of constant warfare. Periods of intense conflict were often interspersed with pragmatic truces and even alliances. Frankish rulers would sometimes ally with one Muslim emir against another, or with a Muslim city against a rival Crusader state. Trade continued across the borders, driven by mutual economic necessity. Diplomatic envoys passed between Jerusalem and Cairo, Antioch and Damascus. These interactions, born of necessity, underscore the complex reality of the Levant, where religious identity was a significant factor, but not the sole determinant of political action. Historians still debate the extent to which these interactions fostered genuine cultural understanding versus merely pragmatic coexistence. Some argue that a distinct outre-mer, overseas, identity began to emerge among the Franks, shaped by their unique circumstances and interactions with local populations, while others emphasize the enduring ties to Europe and the continued influx of new crusaders, which constantly reinforced a sense of difference and superiority. The Crusader states were also vulnerable to internal dissent and external pressure from within the Christian world. The Byzantine Empire, though a Christian power, viewed the Crusader states with deep suspicion. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had initially called for Western aid against the Seljuks, but he had envisioned the return of Byzantine lands, not the establishment of independent Latin kingdoms. The Franks, particularly Bohemond in Antioch, had often reneged on their oaths to restore conquered territories to the Byzantines, leading to a deep and lasting animosity. This Byzantine hostility meant that the Crusader states often faced a potential threat from their Christian neighbors to the west, further complicating their strategic position. The population of the Crusader states remained relatively small, a constant source of anxiety for their rulers. While waves of pilgrims and new crusaders occasionally swelled their numbers, many returned to Europe, and the birth rates among the Frankish population were not high enough to sustain their military needs. This demographic reality meant a perpetual reliance on new arrivals from the West, and a constant need to maintain a strong military presence disproportionate to their overall numbers. The castles, those imposing stone sentinels that dotted the landscape, were not just defensive strongholds, they were symbols of Frankish power, projecting authority over the surrounding lands and serving as vital garrisons for their limited forces. Imagine the daily life within these nascent kingdoms. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing through the narrow streets of Acre, a bustling port city that became the de facto capital after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. The scent of spices from the souks mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread. The sight of Latin knights, clad in mail, riding past Greek Orthodox priests in their dark robes, and Muslim merchants haggling over prices in Arabic. Perhaps these streets whispered stories of compromise and conflict, of fleeting friendships and enduring animosities. The legal systems, too, reflected this blend. The Assizes of Jerusalem, a collection of laws and customs developed by the Frankish jurists, provided a framework for governance, blending elements of feudal law with adaptations to the Levantine context. These laws, though rigorous, also reflected a society grappling with the complexities of ruling diverse populations in an alien land. The consolidation of the Crusader States was a continuous, often brutal process. It involved not only military expansion, but also the establishment of administrative structures, the minting of coins, the construction of churches and cathedrals, and the slow, often difficult integration of diverse populations. The early decades saw a period of expansion, as coastal cities like Acre, Tyre, and Sidon were captured, securing vital supply lines and strategic ports. These conquests, often aided by the Italian fleets, were crucial for the long-term viability of the kingdoms. Yet, this expansion also brought them into closer contact, and often conflict, with the more powerful Muslim entities, setting the stage for the inevitable struggle for survival that would define their history. The very act of building, of settling, of trying to create a new European society in the heart of the Levant, was an act of audacious ambition, fraught with peril and uncertainty. They were, in essence, an experiment in cross-cultural governance, a fragile bridge between East and West, constantly buffeted by the tides of religious fervor, political ambition, and the harsh realities of a distant land. The flickering embers of the Crusader States, though still warm, began to cast longer, more ominous shadows as the 12th century unfolded. Across the sun-baked lands, a new spirit of unification and resistance was stirring, coalescing around figures of remarkable strength and strategic brilliance. Among these, one name rose with the force of a desert whirlwind: Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. Born around 1085, Zengi was a man forged in the crucible of Seljuk power struggles, inheriting a fractured legacy but possessing an unyielding will to restore order and, crucially, to confront the Frankish presence. His early years were marked by a relentless campaign to consolidate power, often through brutal means, yet his vision extended beyond mere territorial gain. Zengi saw the fragmented Muslim world, weakened by internal squabbles and petty rivalries, as an open invitation to the Crusaders. His goal was not just to defeat them in battle, but to unite the disparate emirates under a single formidable banner. He was a master of political maneuvering, playing various factions against each other, always with an eye on the larger prize. The Frankish lords, accustomed to their relatively easy victories against disunited adversaries, initially underestimated him, viewing him as just another ambitious warlord. They would soon learn the depth of their miscalculation. Zengi's rise was gradual, a slow tightening of the noose around the Crusader territories. He captured Aleppo in 1128, a vital strategic city that had long been a thorn in the side of the Franks, often serving as a launching point for their raids. This acquisition gave him a strong base of operations and a significant increase in manpower and resources. From Aleppo, he began to exert pressure on the surrounding Crusader strongholds, particularly the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa. His campaigns were characterized by swift, decisive movements and a keen understanding of siege warfare. He didn't always win and suffered setbacks, but each engagement, win or lose, served to hone his army and his tactics. The atmosphere among the Frankish settlers began to shift from one of confident dominion to a growing unease. Tales of Zengi's ferocity and his growing army spread through the markets and castles. While the Crusader States were still formidable, their internal divisions mirrored those that had once plagued the Muslim world. Rivalries between Jerusalem, Antioch, and Edessa often prevented a unified front, a weakness Zengi exploited with cunning precision. He would often feign attacks on one city to draw forces away from another, only to pivot and strike the undefiled target. It was the county of Edessa that ultimately bore the brunt of Zengi's consolidated power. Edessa, situated far to the east and somewhat isolated from the other Crusader states, had always been vulnerable. It was also a fertile land, rich in resources, making it an attractive target. In the autumn of 1144, Zengi, seizing an opportunity when the Count of Edessa, Jocelyn II, had taken most of his army to aid an ally, launched a surprise attack. He arrived before the city walls with a massive force, estimated to be around 20,000 men. The citizens of Edessa, caught off guard, were ill-prepared for a prolonged siege. The siege of Edessa was a brutal affair, lasting nearly a month. Zengi's engineers employed sophisticated siege engines, including massive trebuchets that hurled stones against the city walls, and sappers who tirelessly dug tunnels beneath the foundations. The defenders fought valiantly, but their numbers were few, and hope of relief from the other Crusader states dwindled with each passing day. On December 24, 1144, Christmas Eve, Zengi's forces finally breached the walls. The ensuing sack of the city was devastating. While Zengi himself reportedly ordered his troops to spare the native Christian population, focusing their wrath on the Frankish inhabitants, the fall of Edessa sent shockwaves across the Latin East and indeed back to Europe. It was the first major Crusader territory to be permanently lost, a stark reversal of fortune that shattered the myth of Frankish invincibility. The news of Edessa's fall reached Europe in the spring of 1145, carried by desperate envoys and merchants. The reaction was one of profound shock and outrage. Pope Eugenius III, deeply concerned by the precarious position of the remaining Crusader states, issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessoris in December 1145, calling for a Second Crusade. This time, the call was not just for knights and adventurers, but for kings. Louis VII of France, a devout monarch, was the first to answer, spurred on by the charismatic abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the crusade with fiery eloquence across France and Germany. Bernard's sermons were so compelling that it was said women would fear for their husbands and sons, knowing they would likely answer the call. The Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad III, initially hesitant, was also persuaded by Bernard's powerful rhetoric. Thus, for the first time, two of Europe's most powerful monarchs would lead a Crusader army. The scale of the undertaking was immense. Tens of thousands of knights, foot soldiers, and pilgrims, accompanied by their retinues, began to gather, forming two vast armies. The logistics of moving such a force across Europe and Asia Minor were staggering and perhaps ultimately insurmountable. The The journey of the Second Crusade was plagued by misfortune and miscalculation from the outset. The German army, under Conrad III, set out first in the spring of 1147. Their march through the Byzantine Empire was fraught with tension, as the Byzantines, wary of the large, undisciplined Crusader force, provided reluctant and often hostile assistance. Supplies were scarce, and skirmishes with local populations were frequent. As they entered Anatolia, they faced the formidable Seljuk Turks, who employed hit-and-run tactics, harassing the Crusaders, cutting off their supply lines, and ambushing their foraging parties. The Germans, unfamiliar with the terrain and the enemy's fighting style, suffered heavy losses. A significant portion of Conrad's army was annihilated at the Battle of Dorylaeum in October 1147, a devastating defeat that echoed the earlier First Crusade struggles in the same region. The French army, led by Louis VII and his formidable queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, followed a similar path, though they initially fared slightly better. They too faced harassment from the Turks and logistical nightmares. The relationship between the French and the Byzantines was also strained, marked by mutual suspicion. By the time the French reached Italia on the southern coast of Anatolia, their army was severely depleted and exhausted. Louis, facing the impossible task of marching the remaining forces across the hostile terrain to Antioch, made the fateful decision to abandon his infantry and sail the rest of his army to Antioch. This choice, while pragmatic, further demoralized his troops and left thousands of pilgrims and soldiers to perish or be enslaved. Meanwhile, Zengi, the architect of Edessa's downfall, met an unexpected end in 1146, just as the Second Crusade was being preached in Europe. He was assassinated by one of his own eunuchs, a man named Yarinkash, reportedly for a minor transgression. His death, while a momentary relief for the Franks, did not halt the tide of Muslim resurgence. Instead, his legacy was taken up by his son, Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi, a man who would prove to be an even greater threat to the Crusader States than his father. Nur ad-Din, born around 1118, inherited his father's strategic acumen and military prowess, but possessed a deeper, more profound religious zeal. He was not just a warlord. He was a Ghazi, a holy warrior deeply committed to the concept of jihad against the Franks. He saw the struggle not merely as a territory, a dispute, but as a sacred duty. His piety earned him immense respect and loyalty from his subjects and soldiers, allowing him to consolidate power even more effectively than his father. He established a reputation for justice and good governance, building mosques, hospitals, and schools, which further cemented his legitimacy and popularity. When the remnants of the Second Crusade finally arrived in the Latin East in early 1148, they found a very different landscape than the one their predecessors had encountered. Nur ad-Din was firmly in control of Aleppo and Damascus, having successfully united these crucial cities. The Crusader leaders, Louis VII and Conrad III, met with the local Frankish lords in Acre to decide on a course of action. The original objective of the crusade had been to recapture Edessa, but with Nur ad-Din's strength and the city's fortifications, this seemed a daunting task. Historians still debate the wisdom of the decision that followed. Instead of focusing on Edessa or even a more vulnerable target, the Crusader leaders, against the advice of some local barons, decided to attack Damascus. Damascus was a powerful, independent Muslim city, ruled by an emir who had at times been an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Nur ad-Din. The decision to attack Damascus alienated a potential ally and consolidated the Muslim world against the Crusaders. Perhaps the Crusaders believed that by capturing Damascus, They could secure the eastern flank of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and prevent Nur ad-Din from expanding further. Or perhaps, blinded by their European notions of grand conquest, they simply chose the most prestigious target. The siege of Damascus began in July 1148. It was a short, disastrous affair. The Crusader army, already weakened and demoralized, faced a well-fortified city and a determined defense. The Damascenes, under the leadership of Mu'in ad-Din Unur, fiercely resisted, launching effective counterattacks. Nur ad-Din, seeing the opportunity, quickly moved his forces to relieve Damascus, threatening the Crusader rear. The Crusaders, plagued by internal dissension, lack of supplies, and the realization that they were fighting a losing battle, abruptly lifted the siege after only 4 days. They retreated in disarray, a humiliating defeat that exposed the deep divisions within the Crusader leadership and the growing strength of their Muslim adversaries. The failure of the Second Crusade was a profound blow to the Crusader cause. It demonstrated that the unified strength of European monarchies was not enough to overcome the challenges of the East, especially when faced with a united and zealous Muslim foe. The prestige of the papacy and the concept of crusading suffered significantly. Many in Europe became disillusioned, questioning the efficacy and divine favor of such expeditions. The Crusader states themselves were left in a more precarious position than ever before, their vulnerabilities exposed and their local Muslim enemies emboldened. Nur ad-Din, on the other hand, emerged from the Second Crusade as the undisputed champion of the Muslim world. His successful defense of Damascus cemented his reputation as a just ruler and a formidable warrior. He continued his campaign of unification, gradually extending his influence across Syria and into Egypt. He was a meticulous planner, a skilled diplomat, and an inspiring leader. His vision was clear: to expel the Franks from the Levant entirely. He understood that this would require not just military might, but also a spiritual revival among his people, fostering a sense of common purpose and religious fervor. He built madrasas, religious schools, and rabats, fortified monasteries, to promote Orthodox Sunni Islam and instill a sense of jihad. The years following the Second Crusade saw a relentless chipping away at Crusader territories. Nur ad-Din systematically targeted their strongholds, often employing patient sieges and strategic maneuver. Steady and costly direct assaults. He captured Apamea in 1149, Inab in 1149, and then further extended his control over northern Syria. He faced occasional setbacks, but his overall trajectory was one of steady expansion and consolidation. The Franks, still plagued by internal squabbles and a diminishing flow of reinforcements from Europe, found themselves increasingly on the defensive, their once bright star beginning to dim under the rising sun of Muslim unity. The legacy of Zengi and Nur ad-Din was not just military, it was also ideological. They cultivated a narrative of holy war, of reclaiming lands unjustly seized. Nur ad-Din, in particular, was seen as a righteous leader, a restorer of Islamic glory. His court became a center of learning and piety, attracting scholars and religious figures. He laid the intellectual and spiritual groundwork for the eventual reconquest of Jerusalem, a task that would ultimately fall to his most famous protege. The Crusader States, once vibrant outposts of Latin Christendom, now found themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded by a resurgent Islamic power, driven by a renewed sense of purpose and a clear, unwavering vision of their ultimate demise. The whispers of the desert winds, once carrying tales of Frankish triumph, now sang a different tune, a song of burgeoning resistance and the slow, inevitable turning of the tide. The desert winds, carrying the scent of distant frankincense and the dust of ancient battlefields, began to whisper a new name across the sands: Saladin. His given name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, and he was a Kurd, born in Tikrit, a city on the Tigris River, in the year 1137. While the Frankish kingdoms in the Levant were struggling with internal strife and the fading zeal of their initial conquests, a powerful new force was consolidating its strength in the lands around them. Saladin's rise was not sudden, but a patient, strategic ascent, marked by military prowess and political acumen. He served under his uncle Shirkuh, a general of the Zengid dynasty, who had been sent to Egypt to restore order amidst the chaos of the declining Fatimid Caliphate. Egypt, with its fertile Nile delta and immense wealth, was a prize coveted by both the Franks and the various Muslim factions. In the 1160s, a series of interventions saw both Amalric I of Jerusalem and Shirkuh vying for control. It was during these campaigns that Saladin honed his skills, learning the intricate dance of diplomacy and warfare. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin, despite being relatively young, was appointed Vizier of Egypt by the Fatimid Caliph. This appointment was a pivotal moment. Within 2 years, Saladin, a staunch Sunni, dissolved the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, bringing Egypt back under the spiritual authority of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Though in practice, he was now its independent ruler. This act not only unified a significant portion of the Islamic world under his banner, but also eliminated a long-standing theological divide that had weakened Muslim resistance to the Crusaders. From his base in Egypt, Saladin began to look northward. His ultimate goal was the reunification of the fragmented Muslim territories and the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Levant. He inherited the mantle of jihad, or holy struggle, from Nur al-Din, the Zengid ruler of Syria, who had been a formidable opponent of the Franks. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Saladin seized the opportunity. He marched into Syria, facing initial resistance from Nur al-Din's heirs. But through a combination of military victories and shrewd negotiations, he gradually brought Damascus, Aleppo, and other key cities under his control. By 1183, he had largely unified Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia into a single, powerful Ayyubid Sultanate, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. This vast new empire, rich in resources and manpower, presented an unprecedented threat to the Crusader States, which, by comparison, were small, isolated enclaves. The Franks, meanwhile, were increasingly plagued by internal divisions. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, once a beacon of Crusader strength, was in decline. Its kings were often weak or afflicted by illness. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, though courageous and militarily skilled, was tragically struck by leprosy, which gradually incapacitated him. His reign was a desperate struggle to maintain the kingdom's precarious existence. Upon his death in 1185, the succession was disputed, leading to a period of instability. Guy of Lusignan, a relative newcomer to the Levant, eventually became king through a combination of political maneuvering and unfortunate circumstances. He was a man of limited military experience and even less political wisdom, and his reign would prove disastrous for the Crusader cause. One of the most provocative figures among the Franks was Renaud of Châtillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain. Renaud was a hardened and ruthless warrior, known for his audacious and often reckless raids. He had a particular penchant for attacking Muslim caravans, including those of pilgrims. which violated existing truces and deeply infuriated Saladin. In 1187, Renaud launched a raid on a large Muslim caravan traveling from Egypt to Damascus, seizing its goods and capturing its occupants. This act was a direct breach of a truce between Saladin and the Franks, and it proved that to be the final straw. Saladin, who had been patiently building his forces and waiting for the opportune moment, vowed to avenge this insult and finally confront the Frankish armies in a decisive battle. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation. Saladin gathered an enormous army, perhaps as many as 30,000 men, a mix of cavalry, archers, and infantry, drawn from across his vast domains. The Frankish forces, led by King Guy, mustered their own army, comprising the Knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and various feudal levies. Their numbers were considerably smaller, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000, but they were heavily armored and renowned for their disciplined charges. The two armies converged near the Horns of Hattin, a pair of extinct volcanic hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The battle, fought on July 4th, 1187, was a catastrophe for the Crusaders. Saladin, a master strategist, had chosen his ground carefully. The Frankish army, desperately short of water in the scorching summer heat, was lured away from the springs of Sepphoris by Saladin's forces. They were forced to march across a parched landscape, constantly harassed by Muslim archers. By the time they reached Hattin, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and demoralized. Saladin's archers rained down arrows, while his cavalry encircled the beleaguered Frankish squares. The dry scrubland caught fire, adding smoke and heat to the oppressive conditions. The discipline that had long been the hallmark of Frankish armies began to break. The battle was a rout. The Frankish army was annihilated. King Guy of Lusignan was captured, along with many of his most prominent nobles and knights. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar and Renaud of Chatillon were also taken prisoner. Saladin, after the battle, personally executed Renaud of Chatillon, fulfilling his vow of vengeance for the caravan raids. He spared King Guy, stating that it is not the wont of kings to kill kings. The holy relic of the True Cross, which the Crusaders had carried into battle as a talisman, was also captured, a devastating blow to their morale and a powerful symbol of their defeat. The victory at Hattin shattered the military power of the Crusader States. With their armies decimated and their leaders captured, the remaining Crusader strongholds were left vulnerable. Saladin moved swiftly to capitalize on his triumph. City after city fell to his forces with little resistance. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, Ascalon, all surrendered within weeks. The speed and scale of Saladin's conquest were astonishing, a testament to his military genius and the demoralized state of the Frankish garrisons. The ultimate prize, of course, was Jerusalem. The city, held by the Crusaders for 88 years, was now isolated and poorly defended. Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem on September 20th, 1187. The city's defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, a prominent Crusader lord who had miraculously escaped Hattin, were few in number and comprised mostly of civilians and a handful of knights. Despite their desperate situation, they put up a brave resistance, knowing that the fall of the Holy City would be a profound blow to Christendom. However, resistance was futile against Saladin's overwhelming forces. After 12 days of intense siege, Balian of Ibelin negotiated the surrender of the city. What followed was a remarkable display of Saladin's magnanimity and adherence to Islamic law. Unlike the brutal sack of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099, which had resulted in a widespread massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Saladin offered terms of surrender that were surprisingly lenient. He allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves, guaranteeing their safe passage out of the city. Those who could not afford the ransom were, in many cases, allowed to leave anyway, or were even ransomed by Saladin himself or wealthy Muslim merchants. This act of clemency stood in stark contrast to the earlier Crusader atrocities and greatly enhanced Saladin's reputation as a just and merciful ruler, even among his enemies. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The golden cross that had adorned the Dome of the Rock for nearly a century was pulled down, and the Islamic crescent was restored. The city's mosques, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which had been converted into churches, were cleansed and reconsecrated for Muslim worship. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe. It was a devastating blow to Christian pride and a rallying cry for a new crusade. The news, carried by fleeing refugees and desperate envoys, ignited a fervor that would soon mobilize the most powerful monarchs of Europe. The recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin was not just a military victory, it was a profound psychological and religious triumph for the Islamic world. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Crusades, shifting the initiative decisively to the Muslim side. For the Franks, it meant the loss of their spiritual heartland and a stark realization of their precarious position. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was reduced to a few coastal cities, notably Tyre, which had managed to hold out against Saladin's advance, thanks largely to the timely arrival of Conrad of Montferrat. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the rapid collapse of the Crusader States after Hattin. Was it solely due to Saladin's military genius and the unified strength of his empire? Or were the internal weaknesses and divisions within the Frankish kingdoms already too deep to overcome? Some scholars emphasize the strategic blunders of King Guy and the reckless actions of figures like Raynald of Châtillon, while others point to the inherent demographic and logistical disadvantages of the Crusader states, perpetually outnumbered and reliant on intermittent reinforcements from Europe. Perhaps the Crusader kingdoms, despite their initial success, were always an artificial construct, destined to crumble once a truly unified and powerful Muslim adversary emerged. The very nature of their existence, as isolated Christian outposts in a predominantly Muslim land, made them vulnerable in the long run. The fall of Jerusalem, however, was not the end of the Crusader story. Far from it. The news, when it reached the ears of the European kings, was met with shock, outrage, and a renewed sense of religious duty. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news, though this is likely apocryphal. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi in October 1187, calling for a new crusade, one that would become known as the Third Crusade. This would be a crusade unlike any before it, involving the most powerful monarchs of Europe: Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Richard I, the Lionheart, King of England. Their combined might, their vast resources, and their legendary military prowess would soon be directed towards the Holy Land, setting the stage for a monumental clash with Saladin, a clash that would define an era and leave an indelible mark on the landscape of the Middle East. The stage was set for a truly epic confrontation, one that would test the limits of courage, faith, and endurance on both sides, as the whispers of war once again echoed across the ancient lands. The desert sun, a relentless painter, continued to bleach the stones of the Crusader states. But beneath its harsh light, a subtle shift in the political winds began to stir. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187, a seismic shock that reverberated across Christendom, had ignited a new fervor, a desperate call to arms that transcended the squabbles of European monarchs. This was the genesis of the Third Crusade, an undertaking far grander in its initial scope and the stature of its participants than any before. Three towering figures of European royalty, each with their own ambitions and vast armies, answered the Pope's plea. From the Holy Roman Empire, the formidable Frederick I, known as Barbarossa or Redbeard, set forth. A seasoned warrior and a cunning statesman, he was already in his late 60s, a venerable emperor whose very presence commanded respect. His path was overland, a perilous journey through the Byzantine Empire and Anatolia, fraught with logistical challenges and skirmishes with local populations. His army, a vast host, was a testament to the enduring power of the Holy Roman Empire, a moving city of tents and armor snaking across the landscape. Then there was Philip II of France, often called Philip Augustus, a younger, shrewd king, keenly aware of the political chess game being played out on the European stage. He harbored a deep-seated rivalry with the English king, a rivalry that would cast a long shadow even over their shared sacred mission. Philip was a meticulous planner, a monarch who understood the long game, and his participation, while ostensibly devout, was also a strategic maneuver to enhance French prestige and influence. And finally, from England came Richard I, the Lionheart, a name that would become synonymous with chivalry and military prowess. Richard was a force of nature, a charismatic and impetuous warrior who lived for battle. His journey was by sea, a grand naval expedition that stopped along the way to conquer Sicily and Cyprus, islands that would serve as crucial logistical bases for the Crusader forces. His reputation preceded him, a blend of awe and fear, and his arrival in the Levant was anticipated with both hope and trepidation by friend and foe alike. The early stages of this grand crusade were marked by a tragic loss. Frederick Barbarossa, after successfully leading his army across thousands of miles, met an unexpected end in June 1190. While crossing the Salef River in Cilicia, a swift-flowing stream, he drowned. The exact circumstances remain somewhat shrouded in the mists of time. Perhaps the current was stronger than he anticipated. Perhaps he suffered a sudden heart attack. Or perhaps the heavy armor dragged him down. This sudden, unforeseen death was a devastating blow to the Crusader cause, causing much of his army to disperse, their morale shattered. Only a fraction continued onward, carrying his body, or what they believed to be it, preserved in vinegar, hoping to bury him in Jerusalem. This unexpected turn of events immediately altered the dynamic of the crusade, leaving the leadership primarily to the French and English kings. The primary objective for the Crusaders was the reclamation of Acre, a vital port city on the Mediterranean coast. Saladin, recognizing its strategic importance, had heavily fortified it, and the siege that ensued was one of the longest and most brutal of the Crusades, lasting for over 2 years, from August 1189 to July 1191. It was a grinding war of attrition, a testament to the resilience of both sides. The Crusader forces, even before the arrival of Richard and Philip, had established a loose siege, but their efforts were often hampered by disease, supply shortages, and internal squabbles. The arrival of Philip Augustus in April 1191, followed by Richard the Lionheart in June, injected new life and leadership into the beleaguered Crusader camp. Their presence immediately intensified the siege, with both kings bringing their formidable siege engines and tactical expertise to bear. Yet the rivalry between them was palpable, a constant undercurrent beneath the veneer of shared purpose. Philip Augustus, ever the pragmatist, was more interested in a swift victory and a return to his European affairs. Richard, on the other hand, was consumed by the glory of battle and the ultimate prize of Jerusalem. The fall of Acre in July 1191 was a significant victory for the Crusaders, a much-needed morale boost. However, the immediate aftermath was marred by a deeply controversial event. Richard, frustrated by delays in Saladin's payment of a ransom for the Muslim prisoners, and perhaps fueled by a desire to send a clear message, ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim captives outside Acre. This act, known as the Massacre of Ayodhya, was a brutal violation of the terms of surrender and remains a dark stain on Richard's reputation. A stark reminder of the harsh realities and ethical compromises of medieval warfare. It also deeply embittered Saladin and his forces, making future negotiations even more challenging. With Acre secured, the path to Jerusalem lay open, but it was a long and arduous one. Philip Augustus, citing illness and the need to attend to his kingdom, departed for France shortly after Acre's fall. His departure left Richard as the undisputed, though often solitary, leader of the Crusader army. This move, while perhaps politically astute for Philip, was viewed by many as a betrayal of the Crusader oath and further cemented the image of Richard as the sole champion of the cause. Richard, now at the helm, embarked on a series of brilliant military campaigns, demonstrating his tactical genius and personal bravery. The Battle of Arsuf in September 1191 was a masterclass in military discipline and timing. As Saladin's forces harried the Crusader march along the coast, Richard maintained a disciplined formation, resisting the urge to break ranks. At the opportune moment, he unleashed a devastating counterattack, shattering Saladin's army and securing the coastal road. This victory was a significant morale booster and a testament to Richard's leadership. Despite these successes, the road to Jerusalem remained elusive. Richard led his army to within sight of the Holy City on two occasions, once in January 1192 and again in June 1192. Each time, however, he made the agonizing decision to turn back. Historians still debate the wisdom of these retreats. Was it a lack of sufficient forces to hold the city if captured? Was it concerns about supply lines stretching too thin? Or was it the realization that even if Jerusalem was taken, it would be incredibly difficult to defend against Saladin's vast resources once the bulk of the Crusader army inevitably returned home? Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors, a pragmatic choice made by a warrior who understood the limits of his resources and the political realities of the region. The emotional toll of these retreats on the Crusaders, who had journeyed so far and endured so much, must have been immense. To stand so close to their ultimate goal, only to turn away. Ultimately, the Third Crusade ended not with a triumphant capture of Jerusalem, but with a negotiated settlement. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. This agreement was a compromise, reflecting the exhaustion of both sides. It stipulated that Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be granted free and safe access to the holy sites. The Crusaders would retain control of a narrow strip of coastal cities, including Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre, providing them with a foothold in the Levant. The Third Crusade, despite its grand ambitions and the legendary figures who led it, achieved limited territorial gains. Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, remained in Muslim hands. However, its impact on Crusader-Muslim relations was profound and complex. The fierce, yet often respectful, rivalry between rich Ard and Saladin became legendary, a testament to the chivalric ideals that both, in their own ways, embodied. Saladin, a devout Muslim and a brilliant military commander, was often depicted by Christian chroniclers as a noble and honorable adversary, a rare instance of admiration for an enemy in such a conflict. Richard, for his part, earned the grudging respect of his Muslim opponents for his courage and military skill. The Third Crusade also highlighted the inherent difficulties of maintaining a unified Christian front. The rivalries between the European monarchs, the logistical nightmares of long-distance warfare, and the challenges of sustaining a large army in a foreign land all contributed to its ultimate outcome. It demonstrated that even with the most powerful kings of Europe at its head, the goal of permanently wresting Jerusalem from Muslim control was an increasingly distant dream. The aftermath of the Third Crusade saw a period of relative calm, a fragile truce in a land that had known little peace for decades. The Crusader States, now smaller and more vulnerable, continued to cling to their coastal enclaves, a testament to the enduring, if diminished, presence of the Latin West in the East. But the memory of Jerusalem, the city that had drawn so many across vast distances, continued to burn brightly in the hearts of Christians, ensuring that the call to crusade, though perhaps less fervent, would echo again in the years to come. The grand aspirations of the Third Crusade had fallen short of their ultimate goal, yet they had etched indelible marks on the landscape of history, shaping the narratives of heroism, conflict, and cultural exchange for centuries to come. The dust settled over the battlefields, but the stories of the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and the Red Beard, and their encounter with the formidable Saladin, had just begun to be told. The air in Venice, thick with the scent of salt and ambition, hummed with a different kind of fervor as the 13th century dawned. The call for a Fourth Crusade had gone out, yet its destination, initially the familiar shores of the Holy Land, would be dramatically, tragically altered. This was a crusade born not purely of religious zeal, but increasingly entangled with the intricate, often ruthless, politics of Western Europe and the burgeoning maritime powers. Knights from France, Flanders, and Italy gathered, but they lacked the funds to pay for their passage across the sea. They turned to Venice, the Queen of the Adriatic, a city whose very existence was predicated on trade and naval might. Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man of advanced age but formidable intellect and cunning, saw an opportunity. He offered the vast Venetian fleet, but at a price that would reshape the very fabric of the crusading movement and the fate of empires. The Crusaders, now deeply indebted to Venice, were persuaded to first capture the Christian city of Zara, a rival port on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian rule. This act, the sacking of a Catholic city by a Catholic army on its way to supposedly fight for Christendom, sent shockwaves through Europe and earned the Crusaders excommunication from Pope Innocent III. Yet the momentum, or perhaps the desperation, of the expedition carried them forward. The stage was now set for an even more profound deviation. A deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, arrived in the Crusader camp with an audacious offer: immense wealth, military aid for the Holy Land, and the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, all in exchange for their help in restoring his father to the throne in Constantinople. The allure of the wealthiest city in the Christian world, a city whose very name conjured images of unimaginable riches and ancient power, proved irresistible to many. The Crusader leaders, facing dwindling supplies and a restive army, saw a solution to their financial woes and a chance for glory that seemed more tangible than the distant, war-torn sands of Outremer. They sailed not east, but across the Aegean, towards the golden walls of Constantinople. Perhaps these walls, built by emperors and steeped in 1,000 years of history, whispered stories not of defense against infidels, but of internal strife and the slow, inevitable creep of external avarice. The arrival of the Crusader fleet before Constantinople in 1203 was a spectacle of awe and dread. The city, with its triple walls, its countless churches, and its bustling harbor, seemed impregnable. Yet the Byzantine Empire, once the undisputed heir to Rome, was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal dynastic struggles, corruption, and a standing army that had dwindled in both size and effectiveness. The Crusaders, after a series of fierce but ultimately successful assaults, managed to place Alexios IV on the throne alongside his father, Isaac II. But the promised riches were not forthcoming. The Byzantine treasury was far emptier than Alexios had claimed, and the populace, resentful of the Latin presence and the heavy taxes levied to pay the Crusaders, grew increasingly hostile. Tensions mounted. The Crusaders, encamped outside the city, grew impatient and aggressive, while the Byzantines, feeling betrayed and exploited, became openly defiant. A series of riots and skirmishes erupted, culminating in a popular uprising that overthrew Alexios IV. This act of perceived treachery ignited the Crusaders' fury. They launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople in April 1204, not as allies, but as conquerors. The ensuing sack of the city was an event of unparalleled devastation. For 3 days, the Crusaders plundered, desecrated, and destroyed. Churches were defiled, relics stolen, ancient manuscripts burned, and countless works of art melted down for their precious metals. The Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Orthodox Christianity, was stripped bare, its altar smashed, and its sacred spaces turned into stables. The scale of the destruction and the wanton brutality shocked even contemporaries. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind such extreme violence. Was it simply greed, fueled by the immense wealth of the city? Was it a deep-seated resentment and cultural animosity between the Latin West and the Greek East, simmering for centuries since the Great Schism of 1054? Or was it a combination of factors, a perfect storm of financial desperation, religious fervor twisted into righteous anger, and a profound misunderstanding of the sophisticated, ancient civilization they were destroying? Whatever the exact blend of causes, the impact was catastrophic. The sack of Constantinople irrevocably shattered the Byzantine Empire, weakening it beyond repair and leaving it vulnerable to future incursions. It also cemented the schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, creating a wound that would take centuries to even begin to heal. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, carving up the Byzantine territories into feudal states. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia, a stark symbol of the West's dominance. Yet this Latin empire was a fragile construct, constantly besieged by remnant Byzantine factions and neighboring powers. It was a pale imitation of the glorious empire it had replaced, lacking the administrative infrastructure, a popular support, and the deep historical roots that had sustained Byzantium for a millennium. The true inheritors of Byzantium retreated to various successor states, such as the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond, where they preserved the flame of Byzantine culture and plotted their eventual return. The Fourth Crusade, therefore, marked a profound turning point in the history of the Crusades. It demonstrated a shift in focus from purely religious objectives to a complex interplay of political ambition, economic opportunism, and inter-Christian conflict. The ideal of crusading, once ostensibly about the liberation of the Holy Land, was now irrevocably tarnished by the brutal assault on a fellow Christian power. This event, more than any other, highlighted the internal contradictions and evolving nature of the crusading movement. Even as the Latin Empire struggled to maintain its grip on Constantinople, the call for new crusades continued, though with diminishing returns and ever-changing targets. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, aimed to capture Egypt, seen as the key to Jerusalem. Led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria, it was a grand undertaking, yet it ultimately failed due to strategic miscalculations and a lack of unified leadership. The Crusaders besieged Damietta, a crucial Egyptian port, for over a year, eventually capturing it. However, their subsequent march on Cairo, despite the offer of Jerusalem in exchange for Damietta by the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, ended in disaster. The Nile flooded, trapping the Crusader army, and they were forced to surrender Damietta in exchange for their lives. This crusade, though less infamous than the Fourth, further underscored the growing difficulties in achieving Crusader objectives in the East. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, launched the Sixth Crusade in 1228. This was a crusade unlike any before it, characterized by diplomacy rather than direct military confrontation. Frederick, a controversial and excommunicated figure, was a man of immense intellect and a deep fascination with Islamic culture. Instead of fighting, he negotiated with Sultan al-Kamil, who was preoccupied with internal conflicts within the Ayyubid dynasty. Through the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229, Frederick remarkably secured control of Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem for the Crusaders, along with a corridor to the coast for a period of 10 years. This achievement, gained without a single major battle, astonished and angered many in the Christian world. Frederick's methods were seen as scandalous by the papacy, who viewed his dealings with a Muslim ruler as an affront to Christian piety. Yet for a brief period, Jerusalem was once again in Christian hands, albeit through a diplomatic solution that challenged the very notion of what a crusade should be. This period also saw the rise of the Children's Crusade in 1212, a poignant and tragic episode that perhaps best illustrates the enduring, if misguided, spiritual fervor that still gripped parts of Europe. Led by charismatic youths like Stephen of Cloyes in France and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany, thousands of children and young adults, believing divine intervention would open the path to Jerusalem, set out for the Holy Land. They were largely unarmed. Many died of starvation and disease on the long march, and those who reached the Mediterranean were often tricked and sold into slavery. This heartbreaking event, while not a formal military expedition, reflected a deep societal yearning for spiritual purity and a belief in miracles, contrasting sharply with the increasingly cynical and politically motivated crusades of the powerful. The Seventh Crusade, led by the devout and revered King Louis IX of France, commenced in 1248. Louis, later canonized as Saint Louis, embodied the traditional Crusader ideal of piety and chivalry. Like the Fifth Crusade, his target was Egypt. He captured Damietta in 1249, but his subsequent advance towards Cairo met with disaster. The Crusader army was decimated by disease and fierce Mamluk resistance. King Louis himself was captured in 1250 and only released after a massive ransom was paid and Damietta was surrendered. His crusade, despite his personal piety and courage, ended in abject failure, a stark reminder of the shifting power dynamics in the East and the formidable strength of the Mamluk Sultanate. Louis IX, undeterred by his earlier defeat, launched an Eighth Crusade in 1270, this time aiming for Tunis, perhaps hoping to convert its ruler or use it as a base for another assault on Egypt. However, the crusade was short-lived and tragic. Louis and many of his troops succumbed to disease, likely dysentery. Shortly after landing in Tunis, his death effectively ended the crusade and marked the last major crusading effort by a European monarch. The crusading ideal, once a powerful unifying force in Europe, was by the late 13th century a fading echo. The fall of Acre in 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant, marked the definitive end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in Outremer had finally, irrevocably died. The nature of crusading ideology had undergone a profound transformation. What began as a spiritual pilgrimage and a holy war against perceived enemies of Christ had evolved into a complex phenomenon intertwined with political ambition, economic gain, and inter-Christian conflict. The focus shifted from the Holy Land to other perceived threats: the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in southern France, the Northern Crusades against pagan peoples in the Baltic, and even crusades against political opponents of the papacy within Europe itself. The very definition of crusade broadened, becoming a tool for papal authority and secular power alike. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade, in particular, cast a long shadow, a constant reminder of the destructive potential when religious zeal was corrupted by worldly ambition, forever altering the relationship between East and West, and ultimately contributing to the decline of the very idea of a unified Christian world. The sun, a persistent golden eye, continued its slow arc across the Levantine sky, but the landscape below was shifting, not just with the passage of seasons, but with the very currents of power and belief. The Sixth Crusade, unlike those that preceded it, arrived not with the thunder of hooves and the clash of swords, but with the subtle rustle of parchment and the careful calculations of a mind steeped in both ambition and intellect. This was the crusade of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man often called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. His story was a tapestry woven with threads of contradiction. Excommunicated by the very Pope who urged the crusade, yet determined to reclaim Jerusalem. Frederick II was a figure of the early 13th century, a monarch unlike any other. Born in Italy, raised in Sicily, he was fluent in 6 languages, a patron of arts and sciences, and possessed a deep fascination with Islamic culture, even maintaining a menagerie of exotic animals, including elephants and giraffes, and employing Muslim scholars and bodyguards. His approach to the Holy Land was not one of fervent religious zeal, but of pragmatic diplomacy. He had promised to lead a crusade years earlier, but had repeatedly delayed, citing illness or political complications within his vast European empire. This infuriated Pope Gregory IX, who saw Frederick's procrastination as a direct challenge to papal authority, leading to his excommunication in 1227. Yet even under this spiritual cloud, Frederick set sail for Acre in 1228, not as a penitent, but as a sovereign. Upon his arrival, the Crusader States were a patchwork of wary allies and simmering rivalries. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, powerful and independent, viewed Frederick with suspicion, seeing him as a secular interloper rather than a divinely appointed leader. But Frederick understood the shifting sands of power in the Ayyubid Sultanate. Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, was embroiled in his own internal struggles, facing threats from his brothers and other Ayyubid princes. He recognized in Frederick a potential ally, or at least a less dangerous adversary than a unified Crusader army. And so, instead of battle cries echoing across the plains, there were envoys carrying messages, negotiations conducted with a delicate balance of threats and promises. In February 1229, a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Jaffa. It was an astonishing achievement. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were returned to Christian control, along with a corridor connecting Jerusalem to the coast. The Muslims retained control of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque within Jerusalem and were granted freedom of worship. The walls of Jerusalem, largely destroyed by Al-Kamil himself to prevent their use by the Crusaders, were not to be rebuilt. This was a bloodless victory, a triumph of diplomacy over brute force, and it shocked both the Christian and Muslim worlds. For the Christians, the return of Jerusalem was a cause for celebration, yet the manner of its acquisition deeply troubled many. Frederick, still excommunicated, had negotiated with the infidel rather than conquering him. When he entered Jerusalem, he found no priest willing to crown him king, so he crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Patriarch of Jerusalem even placed the city under interdict, forbidding religious services, as long as Frederick was present. It was a bizarre spectacle, the holy city reclaimed by a monarch deemed an enemy of the Church. For the Muslims, the treaty was seen by some as a necessary evil, a temporary concession to buy time, while others viewed it as a betrayal by Al-Kamil. The irony was palpable. A crusade led by an excommunicated emperor achieved what years of bloody warfare had not. Frederick's departure in 1229 left the Crusader States in a precarious position. His treaty, while securing Jerusalem, did not foster unity. Instead, it exacerbated the internal scissions. The European powers, particularly the papacy, remained deeply suspicious of Frederick. The local Crusader nobility, accustomed to their own feudal autonomy, resented his attempts to impose imperial authority. The military orders, with their vast landholdings and independent command structures, often acted as states within a state, frequently at odds with each other and with the local lords. The subsequent decades saw a steady decline in the fortunes of the Crusader States. The brief return of Jerusalem was short-lived. In 1244, a Khwarezmian force, displaced by the Mongol invasions sweeping across Asia, swept through the Levant. They were invited by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, Al-Salih Ayyub, who saw them as a useful tool against his Syrian rivals and the remaining Crusaders. The Khwarezmians, fierce and ruthless, sacked Jerusalem, massacring its Christian population and desecrating holy sites. The city was left in ruins, and it would not return to Christian hands until the 20th century. This event, the fall of Jerusalem in 1244, was a devastating blow, far more impactful than its loss to Saladin, as it signaled the complete inability of the Crusader states to defend their most sacred possession. The news of Jerusalem's fall resonated deeply in Europe, sparking calls for a new crusade. This time, the call was answered by a truly pious king, Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. Louis was a man of profound faith, known for his humility, justice, and devotion. He took the cross in 1244, driven by a genuine desire to reclaim the Holy City and protect the remaining Christians in the Levant. His crusade, the Seventh Crusade, launched in 1248, was meticulously planned and well-funded. He initially targeted Egypt, believing that controlling the source of Ayyubid power was the key to securing the Holy Land. Louis' campaign began promisingly, He landed in Egypt and captured Damietta, a strategic port city, in 1249. However, the subsequent advance towards Cairo was plagued by disease, logistical challenges, and fierce Ayyubid resistance. The Crusaders, weakened by dysentery and the relentless heat, were eventually trapped at Mansoura. In a disastrous battle in 1250, Louis's army suffered a crushing defeat, and the king himself was captured. This was a humiliation of epic proportions for the Christian world. Louis was eventually ransomed for a massive sum and the return of Damietta. Despite this devastating defeat, Louis IX remained in the Holy Land for 4 more years, from 1250 to 1254, using his diplomatic skills and vast wealth to strengthen the Crusader fortifications, negotiate truces, and try to bring some semblance of order to the fractured Christian territories. He rebuilt Sidon, Caesarea, and Jaffa, recognizing that strong coastal fortresses were essential for the survival of the remaining Crusader outposts. His presence provided a temporary anchor, but it could not reverse the tide of decline. The internal strife within the Crusader states continued unabated, a slow, corrosive poison. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa, the dominant maritime powers, frequently erupted into open warfare in the streets of Acre and Tyre, crippling trade and diverting resources. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, though fierce defenders against Muslim forces, were often locked in bitter feuds over land, prestige, and prisoners. The local nobility, the Poulans, the term for European settlers born in the Levant, had their own dynastic squabbles, often inviting external powers, both Christian and Muslim, to intervene in their petty disputes. One particularly telling example of this fragmentation was the War of St. Sabas, which raged in Acre from 1256 to 1258. This was a conflict between the Venetian and Genoese quarters of the city, ostensibly over the possession of the monastery of St. Sabas, but truly a proxy war for commercial supremacy. Both sides enlisted the support of the military orders and local barons, turning the most important Crusader city into a bloody battleground. Houses were burned, churches desecrated, and the streets ran with blood, all while the Mamluks, a new and formidable power, were rising in Egypt. The Mamluks, a military slave class who had overthrown the Ayyubids in Egypt in 1250, were a disciplined and highly effective fighting force. Their sultans, particularly Baybars, were determined to eradicate the remaining Crusader presence. Baybars, a brilliant military strategist, systematically dismantled the Crusader strongholds one by one. He understood the importance of cutting off their supply lines and isolating their fortresses. He captured Caesarea and Arsuf in 1265, destroying their fortifications and ensuring they could not be used again. The fall of Antioch in 1268 was a particularly brutal event. Baybars besieged the city, which had been a Crusader principality for over 170 years. When it fell, the Mamluks massacred much of its population and enslaved the rest. The great cathedral of St. Peter was desecrated, and the city was systematically razed. The destruction of Antioch sent shockwaves through Europe, highlighting the dire situation of the Crusader states and the growing power of the Mamluks. Another lesser-known detail that underscores the internal strife and desperation was the so-called Shepherd's Crusade of 1251 in France. While Louis IX was still held captive in Egypt, a charismatic, albeit dubious leader named Jacob, known as the Master of Hungary, emerged, claiming to have received a vision. He gathered a massive army of peasants and commoners, promising to rescue the king. This movement, however, quickly devolved into lawlessness, attacking clergy, Jews, and anyone perceived as an enemy. It was eventually suppressed by royal forces, demonstrating the volatile social climate in Europe and the desperate yearning for a messianic figure to solve the Holy Land crisis, even if it manifested in destructive ways. The later Crusades, including the Eighth Crusade led by Louis IX once more in 1270, were increasingly futile. Louis, still consumed by his religious zeal, launched this final crusade against Tunis, hoping to convert its ruler and then use it as a base to attack Egypt. However, the expedition was ravaged by disease, and Louis himself died of dysentery outside Tunis, his last whispered word reportedly, Jerusalem. His death marked the end of an era of major crusading efforts by European monarchs. The Crusader States, now reduced to a few coastal enclaves, primarily Acre, Tyre, and Sidon, were living on borrowed time. They were isolated, internally divided, and facing an increasingly powerful and unified Mamluk Sultanate. The European support that had once slowed, however intermittently, was now a trickle. The enthusiasm for crusading had waned, replaced by cynicism and a focus on European dynastic struggles. The Mongol threat, which had briefly offered a glimmer of hope for a Christian-Mongol alliance against the Mamluks, ultimately proved unreliable. While the Mongols did inflict a significant defeat on the Mamluks at the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar in 1299, they never fully committed to a sustained campaign in the Levant. The final act of the Crusader drama unfolded in 1291 with the fall of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Baybar's successor, amassed a formidable army and besieged the city. The defense was desperate but ultimately futile. The city's walls, battered by Mamluk siege engines, crumbled. The remaining defenders, including the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, fought heroically, but they were overwhelmed. The fall of Acre was a brutal and decisive end. The city was sacked, its inhabitants massacred or enslaved, and its fortifications systematically dismantled to prevent any future Christian return. With the fall of Acre, the remaining Crusader outposts along the Syrian coast quickly fell or were abandoned. Tyre, Sid, On, Beirut, all were taken by the Mamluks in the following weeks. The Crusader States, which had endured for nearly 2 centuries, ceased to exist on the mainland. A few small islands, like Ruad, remained in Christian hands for a few more years, but their strategic importance was negligible. The dream of a lasting Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was over. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the ultimate failure of the Crusader States. Was it their inherent weakness and internal divisions? Was it the overwhelming power and unity of the Mamluks? Or was it the changing political landscape in Europe, where the fervor for crusading had simply faded? Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors, a slow, inevitable decline brought about by a lack of sustained commitment from Europe, coupled with the relentless pressure from a formidable and determined adversary. The Crusader experiment, born of religious zeal and military ambition, ultimately succumbed to the harsh realities of geopolitics, the relentless passage of time, and the enduring power of those who called the land their own. The wind, sweeping across the now empty plains where castles once stood, seemed to whisper tales of grand ambitions and their ultimate, quiet dissolution. The air, once thick with the scent of Frankish ambition and the distant murmur of Latin hymns, began to carry a different fragrance now. The sharp tang of desert dust, the metallic hint of steel, and the growing shadow of a new, formidable power. The tide had truly turned, not with a sudden crash, but with a relentless, methodical advance, much like the desert wind eroding ancient stone. The fragmented Crusader states, once proud beacons on the Levantine coast, now resembled isolated islands, their connections fraying, their hope dimming. The Mamluks, those warrior slaves forged in the crucible of Egypt, had risen to become the undisputed masters of the region, their banners a stark warning to any who clung to the dream of a permanent Latin East. Their story was one of remarkable ascent. Originally Turkic slaves, purchased and trained as elite soldiers, they had seized power in Egypt in the mid-13th century, establishing a dynasty that would dominate the Middle East for centuries. Their strength lay in their rigorous training, their fierce loyalty to their own, and their unwavering commitment to expelling the remaining crusaders. Among them, two names stood out, etched into the annals of both Mamluk triumph and Crusader despair: Baybars and Kalawun. Baybars, a man of immense cunning and military genius, ascended to the Sultanate in 1260, following the pivotal Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mamluks had decisively halted the Mongol advance, a victory that had not only saved their own burgeoning empire, but perhaps inadvertently spared the remnants of the Crusader States from an even more terrifying fate. With the Mongol threat temporarily abated, Baybars turned his formidable attention to the Franks. His campaigns were not impulsive raids, but carefully planned, systematic sieges designed to dismantle the Crusader presence piece by piece. He understood the strategic importance of each castle, each port city, and he moved with ruthless efficiency. In 1265, Baybars struck at Caesarea, a coastal city that had seen centuries of history unfold upon its shores, from Roman grandeur to Crusader fortifications. The siege was swift and brutal. The Mamluk engineers, masters of siege warfare, undermined the walls, and the city fell. Not long after, Arsuf, another Crusader stronghold south of Acre, met a similar fate. Baybars' strategy was clear: isolate the major cities by removing their surrounding defenses, slowly tightening the noose. Then came the fall of Antioch in 1268, a moment that sent shivers through the Latin West. Antioch, one of the original Crusader states, had stood for over 170 years, a symbol of Frankish endurance. Its capture by Baybars was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. The city was sacked, its inhabitants enslaved or put to the sword, and its grand cathedral, once a testament to Latin Christianity, was desecrated. The message was unmistakable: no Crusader stronghold, no matter how ancient or seemingly impregnable, was safe. The scale of the destruction at Antioch was so profound that it remained largely deserted for many years, a stark monument to Mamluk might. Historians still debate the extent to which the internal squabbles and lack of unified command among the Crusader states contributed to their downfall, especially during Baybars' relentless campaigns. While the Mamluks presented a formidable external threat, the Frankish lords often prioritized their own petty rivalries, squabbling over land, trade routes, and even succession, rather than presenting a united front. Perhaps the memory of their shared purpose had faded, replaced by the mundane concerns of feudal politics in a foreign land. Baybars continued his systematic dismantling. Safed, a strong castle of the Knights Templar, fell in 1266 after a protracted siege, its defenders massacred despite promises of safe passage. Crac de Chevaliers, the magnificent Hospitaller fortress, often considered one of the finest examples of Crusader military architecture, finally capitulated in 1271 after a month-long siege. Its fall was a testament to Baybars' persistence and the overwhelming force he could bring to bear. The Mamluks employed a clever ruse, forging a letter from the Hospitaller Grand Master, ordering the garrison to surrender, which ultimately broke the defenders' will. The castle, once a symbol of Crusader invincibility, now stood as a silent Mamluk sentinel overlooking the plains. Baibars passed away in 1277, leaving behind an empire vastly expanded and a crusader presence severely diminished. But the work of expulsion was far from over. His successor, Sultan Kalawan, picked up the mantle with equal determination. Kalawan, a former Mamluk emir, had witnessed Baibars' campaigns firsthand and shared his predecessor's vision of a Levant free of Frankish presence. He was a shrewd diplomat as well as a skilled military commander, often employing treaties and truces to gain strategic advantages before striking. In 1285, Kalawan turned his attention to Margat, another formidable hospitaller castle perched on a volcanic cone. The siege of Margat was a testament to Mamluk engineering prowess. They constructed massive siege engines and dug extensive tunnels, ultimately undermining a section of the wall, forcing the Hospitallers to surrender. The fall of Margat further isolated the remaining Crusader strongholds, making their situation increasingly precarious. Then, in 1289, came the Siege of Tripoli. Tripoli, a vibrant port city and the capital of the county of Tripoli, had endured for over 180 years. Its fall was particularly poignant. Kalawan's forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, surrounded the city. The defenders, a mix of local Franks, Italian merchants, and a small contingent of knights, fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Mamluks relentlessly pounded the walls with catapults and trebuchets, and after a month of fierce fighting, they breached the defenses. The city was sacked, its population either killed or enslaved, and its once thriving harbor filled with debris. The destruction was so complete that the city was eventually rebuilt inland, its coastal ruins a somber reminder of its violent end. With Tripoli gone, only a handful of Crusader outposts remained, most notably Tyre, Sidon, and the last great bastion, Acre. Acre, once the dazzling capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had become the nerve center of the remaining Crusader presence. It was a bustling port, a hub of trade, and a refuge for those who had fled the fallen cities. Its walls were formidable, strengthened over decades, and its harbor was always busy with ships bringing supplies and, occasionally, fresh recruits from Europe. But it was also a city of internal tensions, where the rivalries between the military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, and the various Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, often simmered beneath the surface, occasionally boiling over into open conflict. This disunity, a recurring theme in the Crusader story, would prove to be their undoing in their final hour. The stage was set for the final act. Sultan Kalawan, having systematically dismantled the lesser strongholds, now focused his entire might on Acre. However, he passed away in November 1290, before he could launch the final assault. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, immediately took up his father's vow, determined to complete the conquest. Khalil, eager to prove his own military prowess, assembled an army of unprecedented size, estimated to be around 100,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry, along with a vast array of siege engines. The scale of this force was overwhelming for the defenders of Acre, whose numbers, even with reinforcements, barely reached 15,000, including knights, foot soldiers, and civilian volunteers. The siege of Acre began on April 5, 2091. The Mamluk army encircled the city, stretching for miles, their siege engines arranged in terrifying arc. The sound of their preparations, the creaking of timber, the shouts of thousands of men must have echoed ominously within Acre's walls. The Mamluks brought to bear the most advanced siege technology of the age, including enormous trebuchets capable of hurling massive stones and even Greek fire. One such trebuchet, named the Victorious, was said to be so powerful that it could smash through the strongest fortifications. The defenders of Acre, led by the Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers, Jacques de Molay and Jean de Villiers, along with the King of Cyprus and Jerusalem, Henry II, fought with desperate courage. They launched sorties, attempting to disrupt the Mamluk siege lines, and they repaired their walls under constant bombardment. The smell of burning timber, dust, and human sweat filled the air. The nights were lit by the glow of Mamluk campfires and the flashes of their siege engines. But the Mamluk assault was relentless. They concentrated their attacks on key sections of the walls, particularly the accursed tower and the Gate of St. Anthony. Day after day, the bombardment continued, shaking the very foundations of the city. The Mamluk sappers, protected by movable shelters, dug tunnels beneath the walls, filling them with combustibles and setting them alight, causing sections of the fortifications to collapse. On May 18, 1291, after weeks of intense bombardment and tunneling, the Mamluks launched their final decisive assault. They breached the city walls in multiple places. The fighting was brutal and desperate, hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets and on the crumbling ramparts. The Templars particularly fought with legendary ferocity, making their last stand in their fortified compound near the sea. The Hospitallers, too, fought to the last man. As the Mamluks poured into the city, chaos erupted. Many civilians tried to flee to the harbor, hoping to escape by ship. But the Mamluk cavalry pursued them relentlessly. The sea itself turned red with blood. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was among the last to escape, but many of his knights died defending their compound, which eventually collapsed, burying both Mamluks and Templars beneath its ruins. The fall of Acre was complete. The city, once a vibrant cosmopolitan hub, was utterly destroyed. Its magnificent buildings were razed, its churches desecrated, and its population either massacred or enslaved. The Mamluks, determined to prevent any future Crusader attempts to reclaim the city, systematically dismantled its fortifications and filled in its harbor, ensuring it could never again serve as a base for a Christian army. The destruction was so thorough that for centuries Acre remained a desolate ruin, its former glory a mere whisper on the wind. With the fall of Acre, the last significant Crusader presence in the Levant vanished. Tyre and Sidon, isolated and vulnerable, fell soon after, their garrisons evacuating rather than facing a similar fate. The dream of a Latin kingdom in the East, born of fervor and conquest 2 centuries earlier, had finally come to an end. The Crusader States, once a vibrant, if often troubled part of the Mediterranean tapestry, were no more. Their legacy, however, would continue to echo through the centuries, shaping perceptions, inspiring tales, and leaving an indelible mark on the landscape and the collective memory of East and West. The final chapter of this particular story was closed, but the broader narrative of cultural exchange, conflict, and transformation in the region continued, forever altered by the Crusades. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked not merely the end of a city, but the practical dissolution of the Crusader States in the Levant. With the last significant stronghold gone, the remaining scattered garrisons and fortified outposts quickly crumbled or were abandoned. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, one by one, these coastal cities, which for 2 centuries had flown the banners of European lords, returned to Mamluk control. The Frankish presence, once a vibrant, if often embattled, tapestry woven into the fabric of the Near East, was reduced to a few island holdings like Cyprus and Rhodes, far removed from the mainland they had once sought to claim. The dreams of a Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, stretching from Antioch to Aqaba, faded into memory, preserved in chronicles and the increasingly elaborate tales told in distant European courts. The immediate aftermath for the region was complex. The Mamluks, now undisputed masters of Syria and Palestine, set about dismantling the formidable Crusader castles, not out of spite, but as a strategic imperative to prevent any future European incursions from re-establishing a foothold. Crac de Chevaliers, Margat, Safed, these colossal fortresses, once symbols of Crusader power, were either razed or repurposed, their massive stones sometimes incorporated into new Mamluk structures. This systematic demolition reflected a deep-seated apprehension of renewed Crusader activity, an apprehension that, while ultimately unfounded on a large scale, persisted for generations. The coastal plains, once bustling with Frankish trade and agricultural ventures, saw a gradual demographic shift as the European settlers either fled, were killed, or, in some cases, assimilated into the local populations, their descendants perhaps retaining faint echoes of Latin names or customs. In Europe, the news of Acre's fall was met with a mixture of shock, sorrow, and a profound sense of failure. For generations, the Crusades had been a central pillar of European identity, a unifying cause that transcended national boundaries, even as those boundaries were becoming more defined. Popes continued to call for new crusades, and monarchs occasionally pledged their support. But the fervor and widespread participation of earlier centuries had largely evaporated. The political landscape of Europe was changing rapidly. Emerging nation-states like France and England were increasingly focused on internal consolidation and dynastic rivalries, their resources diverted from distant holy wars. The economic incentives, too, had shifted. While trade with the East remained lucrative, it no longer required military conquest. Venice and Genoa, among others, found it more profitable to engage in commerce with the Mamluks, even signing treaties that allowed their merchants access to Levantine ports. The long-term impact of the Crusades on Europe is a subject of ongoing historical debate. On one hand, they undoubtedly stimulated intellectual and cultural exchange, albeit often indirectly. Returning Crusaders brought back not just exotic goods and spices, but also new ideas, technologies, and scientific knowledge from the more advanced Islamic world. Arabic numerals, advancements in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, even certain architectural styles, found their way into European thought and practice, contributing to the intellectual ferment that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The Crusades also fostered the growth of maritime trade, expanding European commercial networks and paving the way for future voyages of exploration. The demand for Eastern goods spurred innovation in shipbuilding and navigation, skills that would prove crucial in the age of discovery that followed. However, the Crusades also left a more complex legacy. They deepened the schism between the Latin West and the Orthodox East, a wound that never fully healed. The brutal sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade remains a particularly painful memory for Orthodox Christians, forever staining the idea of Western liberation. This event, more than any other, cemented a mutual distrust and animosity that persisted for centuries. Within Europe, the Crusades contributed to the consolidation of papal power in the early stages, allowing the papacy to assert its authority over secular rulers. Yet, the ultimate failure of the Crusades also eroded some of that moral authority. particularly as the economic and human costs mounted without tangible spiritual or territorial gains. The rise of mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans, while not directly caused by the Crusades, offered alternative forms of spiritual devotion and service that sometimes competed with the martial piety of the crusading ideal. For the Middle East, the legacy was even more profound and in many ways more devastating. The Crusades were an era of intense conflict and destruction, leaving behind a trail of ruined cities and countless lives lost. While the Frankish presence was ultimately temporary, it left an indelible mark on the region's collective memory. The experience of foreign invasion and occupation fostered a sense of unity among various Muslim factions, contributing to the rise of powerful figures like Saladin and the Mamluks, who successfully expelled the invaders. This period also saw the development of a rich body of Arabic literature and historiography that documented the Crusades from an Islamic perspective, often portraying the Franks as uncivilized barbarians driven by greed and religious fanaticism. These narratives, passed down through generations, shaped perceptions of the Frange and contributed to a long-standing wariness of Western intervention. One lesser-known detail of the Crusades' aftermath is the fate of the military orders. While their mainland strongholds were lost, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar did not immediately vanish. The Hospitallers, demonstrating remarkable resilience, relocated their headquarters to Cyprus and then, in 1309, to the island of Rhodes, where they established a powerful maritime state. For over 2 centuries, they continued to wage a naval holy war against Muslim shipping in the eastern Mediterranean, embodying a continuation of the crusading spirit long after the mainland Crusader States had fallen. The Templars, however, met a far more tragic end. Their immense wealth and influence, coupled with their secretive nature, made them a target for King Philip IV of France. In 1307, Philip launched a systematic campaign of arrests and torture, accusing the Templars of heresy, idolatry, and various other crimes. Under duress, many confessed, and in 1312, Pope Clement V, under immense pressure from Philip, formally dissolved the order. Their vast properties were seized, and many of their leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake. This sudden and brutal suppression sent shockwaves across Europe, demonstrating the shifting balance of power between secular monarchs and the Church, and effectively ending the era of the great military orders as a dominant force. The scholarly debate surrounding the Crusades is vast and multifaceted. Historians still disagree profoundly on their fundamental nature and motivations. Were they primarily religious wars, driven by genuine piety and a desire to reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom? Or were they, as some argue, more about economic expansion, political opportunism, and the channeling of internal European violence outwards? Some scholars emphasize the role of pilgrimage and the spiritual rewards promised to crusaders, while others point to the material incentives and the desire for land and wealth. The very term crusade itself is a modern construct, applied retrospectively to a series of campaigns that contemporaries often referred to as pilgrimages or holy wars. This semantic distinction highlights the difficulty in imposing a singular interpretation on such a diverse and prolonged historical phenomenon. The impact on interfaith relations is another point of contention. Did the Crusades irrevocably poison relations between Christianity and Islam, creating a legacy of conflict that endures to this day? Or were they merely one chapter in a long history of intermittent conflict and cooperation, with periods of peaceful coexistence and trade often overlooked in the dramatic narratives of war. The legacy of the Crusades continues to resonate in contemporary discourse, often invoked in political rhetoric and cultural narratives. In the West, they are sometimes romanticized as an era of chivalry and heroic struggle, while in parts of the Middle East, they are remembered as a period of foreign aggression and colonial intrusion. These differing interpretations underscore the enduring power of historical memory and the ways in which past events are shaped and reshaped to serve present-day concerns. Yet, beyond the political and cultural appropriations, the Crusades remain a pivotal moment in global history. They connected distant worlds, facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, and profoundly shaped the destinies of both Europe and the Middle East. The echoes of their triumphs and failures, their piety and their brutality, continue to whisper through the centuries, reminding us of the complex interplay of faith, power, and human endeavor. The castles, now silent ruins, stand as enduring testaments to an era when two civilizations clashed and intertwined, leaving behind a legacy that continues to be explored and understood.